My name is Kimi Jackson and I'm the director of ProBar. ProBar provides legal services to children who are detained in the Rio Grande Valley of South Texas. We've been doing this work for more than a decade and we've developed special expertise in the area of working with children from Central America. Screening children requires special skills which are different from those working with an adult, and I hope that you find this information helpful.
Good morning, my name is Edgar. This portion of the presentation is in regards to how to conduct screenings with unaccompanied immigrant children. I hope this training is found useful for you and your staff, and I also encourage you to watch the other two presentations on working with Central American children and how to provide a Know Your Rights presentation. The purpose of screenings is to gain an understanding of the child's life experience and to assess whether or not the child qualifies for legal relief. There are several goals that we want to accomplish during the intake process. First and foremost, this is our chance to build a relationship with the child. We also want to use the screening to extract biographical information, to understand why the child left their home country, to understand why they traveled through the US, and to assess whether or not they are eligible for some kind of legal relief under the law. Understand that for many of these children, it is their first time away from their home country, from their family and friends. They are in a completely new environment that is unfamiliar to them, and so they may be hesitant to disclose personal information. Children may be incredibly shy and reserved when meeting new individuals in a new country. Building a very positive relationship with the child is the most important and challenging task to accomplish initially. And now we have to go through the physical setup of the interview. First and foremost, we need the appropriate space to conduct the screening. Most importantly, it is recommended that you conduct the screening in a private room with no outside distractions available. Second, give the child choices on where they want to sit. You may not yet know where you're going to conduct the screening, but ideally, you want to hold the interview in a room where there is a table, a couple of chairs for you and the child, and a window or a door immediately available for the child to understand that there is an exit available for him or her. As far as seating, you want to sit adjacent to the child. It's recommended that you don't have the child sit directly across from you because that tends to create more of an adversarial setting and not so much of an interview atmosphere. You want the child to feel comfortable and give them choices as to where they want to sit. Try to sit at a right angle from the child, not across the table, and allow the child to see the door and the window in the room. Offer the child something to occupy his or her hands with, such as a stress ball, coloring book, some toys. This way it'll relax them, ease their mind from the interview, and make them more comfortable in disclosing information to you. Even if you're working with teenagers, it's also recommended that you offer them something to occupy their hands with, such as Play-Doh, toys, coloring books. It may not look age appropriate, but it goes a long way for them to develop a more relaxed atmosphere. Also, it's just as important to give your child undivided attention. Turn off your mobile devices, put them on silent, close and put aside your other files and notes from other cases, remove any possible distractions for both you and the child, and show your commitment to keeping the child's information confidential. Following the setup, it's best to start the introduction of the interview. Explain who you are, what you do, why you are meeting with the child, state physically where you and the child are, and explain the purpose of the interview. For example, my name is Edgar and I work for ProBar. I don't work with the government or for this shelter. My job is to help you understand your situation with immigration and to see how we can help you. As a general rule, if the child begins to ask you personal questions, try not to engage with the child and remind them that why you're here, to learn about their story and their situation. It's okay to disclose some information about yourself if you find that may make the child more comfortable in talking to you, but for the most part, try to avoid disclosing personal information about yourself and keep the focus on the child and on the interview. Furthermore, it's important to remind the child that at any time during the interview, they are allowed to take a break. They can use the restroom, wash their hands, wash their face, and just take a break from the intensity of the interview to gather their thoughts, gather their emotions, and come back to you again. Explain that you will write down the child's responses as you begin to ask him or her questions. For example, something you might want to say is, I will be taking notes about what we talk about today so that I can remember everything about your life. Sometimes I may need your help to make sure I get everything right. This not only helps you gain a better, more accurate understanding of the child's facts, but it also makes the interview feel more inclusive and gives the child a greater proactive role in assisting you in developing those accurate facts. Ask what the child's best language is and offer to proceed in that language. Sometimes Central American children can speak an indigenous language. Mention a few such as Quiche, Mom, Canjobal, to encourage the minor to inform you. Many indigenous language speakers are reluctant or shy to admit they don't speak Spanish because they may be embarrassed. And if an interpreter is needed, explain the role of the interpreter in the interview. Remind the child that they need not be shy or embarrassed at all about their first language. Make them understand that it is better to proceed in their language rather than try to develop facts in Spanish or language that they may not be so unfamiliar with. And please keep in mind that not all Central American children speak fluent Spanish. Always offer an interpreter as an option, and it's important to know that a child's language barrier does not categorize them as having some sort of competence or capacity issue. Always speak slower and enunciate with your Spanish. Everyone has a different intonation when they speak Spanish. Keep in mind that perhaps the Spanish that we're used to here in the US and in Mexico is much different than the Spanish that they know in Central America. Some terminology in one country means something completely different in another country. Don't ever feel embarrassed about asking a word or what a word or a phrase means. Children are often excited and forthcoming about revealing aspects of their culture and their language to newcomers. Furthermore, encourage the child to ask for clarification when they don't understand a question. It's always a good idea to remind the child that it's okay if they don't know the answer to a question, if they can rephrase their answers in more simpler terms. Let the child know that it's okay. Children tend to answer questions even if they don't understand because they want to please the adult and they want to give you an answer. Always assume a misunderstanding before a lie and look for answers that don't make sense. These are usually signs that the child does not understand your question. And on concluding the introduction, explain that after you're done asking questions, they will always have an opportunity to ask you questions. Explain that if you don't know the answer to something, you will then inform them. It's okay that you don't know or give a variety of possible options about what the next step is, but never lie to the child. Gauge the child's understanding of what you are saying, and it is perfectly acceptable to ask follow-up questions. In Central American Spanish, children may respond better to the word usted rather than tú when speaking directly to them. It may be viewed as rude to use the more informal tú when you're not familiar with the other individual. Watch for body language, discomfort, and allow for breaks, such as a bathroom break, a water break. Always offer them the option to speak to someone else. For example, a female colleague if you're speaking to a female child, or a male colleague if you're a female and you're speaking to a male child who prefers to disclose their information to another male. Try not to show your own emotions as an interviewer, such as embarrassment, confusion, dismay, during the intake. When this happens, children are very intuitive and will usually stop talking if they sense that the interviewer is overwhelmed and uncomfortable. It is always appropriate to show sympathy and concern, but try not to be overwhelmed by your own emotions. During the interview, it's always important to be sensitive to a child and avoid categorizing them. A child's age and education are important factors, but never presume a lack of capacity or competence based solely on those factors. Avoid making any assumptions based on a single answer provided by the child during the interview. Start with the simple questions first, and then build to the harder and more personal questions as you build a relationship with the child during the interview. While you're asking questions, it is important to choose very simple wording and avoid any sort of legal terminology or complicated words. Try to use the same language the child uses to describe events when they're speaking and ask follow-up questions in their words. If the child's meaning would not be clear to another person reviewing the intake, write what the child meant by the expression or word that they were using. For example, use show and tell me versus describe and depict, or use gun versus the word weapon. Throughout the interview, it's also important to keep in mind that our job is to not re-traumatize a child of traumatic or important events that happen throughout their life. Try to take a snapshot to minimize re-trauma to the child. Please be careful. There may not be a need to go into in-depth screening if the child is becoming overwhelmed when recounting events in their country. If they seemed overwhelmed, take a break, come back to the interview, or try to shorten it down and not go too much into detail. If this happens, get the general outline and then let an attorney or come back another day to ask the more tough, in-depth questions. Even though something may not have happened to the child, they may often have times witnessed something incredibly traumatic, violent, painful events during their journey from their home country. And as a recommendation, always ask what happened after that, to solicit details without asking in detail about a particular event. Especially when you're talking about trauma, asking a simple question such as what happens, or ¿y qué más pasó? ¿Qué pasó después? Will help the child transition in disclosing information in a more calmer way without thinking too much about the direct trauma and the details of the event. However, not all children become re-traumatized when disclosing events. As interviewers, we need to gauge the emotional level of the child during the intake process, and if you feel that they're comfortable disclosing information, as many children are, then it's okay to proceed. But if you do feel that they are hesitant to disclose a traumatic event or start to break down or become emotional, it's always important to ask them how they're doing, how they're feeling, and it's okay to remind them that taking a break is absolutely fine. Try not to interrupt the child during a narrative. Tolerate pauses, even long ones. If the child becomes emotionally distressed, you always use your best judgment before asking more details. Remind the child that the purpose of the interview is to get an overview of their life and that they don't need to go into details if they're not yet ready to. Sometimes the child may just need a short break or will be willing to speak to you again in greater detail the following day. But give the child some time to recollect themselves. If the child does become emotionally distressed, offer them the options to take a break, use the bathroom, visit with their clinicians for counseling, or come back another day to complete the interview. Before ending the screening, talk about something normal and uplifting at the end of the interview to help the child get their mind from previous traumatic events. Remind the child where they are, that there's help available to them. Refer the child to their clinician or counseling, of course with their permission, if they become emotionally distressed. During the interview, it's important to manage expectations. Don't promise the child anything. Be honest, even when the truth is not what the child wants to hear. Many best practice guides recommend avoiding statements such as, I understand, and it will be okay, because it sometimes may not be okay. I'm sorry that happened to you is generally accepted as an okay response. You can also acknowledge the difficulty of the child's situation and what they went through and how difficult it is to speak about a traumatic experience. Tell the child that you admire their strength and appreciate their willingness to share their story. Assure the child that they did the right thing in telling an adult about their problems. The child may be frightened if the abuser has threatened to harm the child or others if they have disclosed the abuse, but remind them that they are in a safe place, in a safe environment, and that this information will hopefully help them with their situation. If a child becomes distressed during the interview, try to do what you can to help them alleviate that stress. For example, if the child begins to break down and cry in front of you, offer them some tissue paper, tell them, would you like to take a restroom break, wash your face, walk around for a little bit, then come back when you're ready to continue the interview. Sometimes the children may just need a moment during the interview to collect their thoughts again. It's totally acceptable to take a break within the interview, and they may not even need to go outside or do something extra to come back to you. Sometimes they may just need to wipe their tears away, and then they're ready to continue speaking to you. Something I would do when speaking to a distressed child is, while continuing the interview, discreetly offer them some tissue paper in front of them within their reach, and keep asking questions. If I notice that they don't grab the tissue paper, then it's usually a signal that they're okay to keep going. But if I notice that they do grab the tissue and they're wiping their eyes with it, then I can offer them a restroom break or break from the interview and continue on in a few moments. Furthermore, if the child discloses any violence that occurred here in the US, it is our obligation to file the report with Child Protective Services during the next 48 hours. Refer that instance to their clinician, to their case manager with their permission, of course. Mandatory reporting laws will vary state by state, but consider referring the child to an organization that is an expert in interviewing child victims of violence. These organizations may offer forensic interviewing, child-friendly environment where law enforcement, child protective service specialists, prosecution, medical, and mental health professionals will share information and develop effective, coordinated strategies that are sensitive to the needs of the child. During the interview, sometimes children recant. It's normal. This is a completely okay process. Don't blame them. Don't assume that they're lying. Usually they are just scared and distressed during the interview. Assume that the child is stressed and afraid and believe that they will get in trouble for disclosing sensitive information before coming to the conclusion that the child is lying to you. Traumatized children especially are more likely to have discrepancies when recalling an event. Assume memory suppression before thinking that they're deliberately lying to you. Children have heard different rumors from family members, abusers, smugglers, and even fellow children in the shelter about disclosing personal information to you. Begin with questions the child knows the answers to help facilitate their confidence level and ease the interview process. Simple questions such as, what is your name? Is your name written correctly on the notice to appear or the aviso de comparecer? How old are you? Do you know when your birthday is? What country are you from? Who is your case manager? Are you single, married, or divorced? Do you have any children? What languages do you speak, and which one do you speak best? Who would you live with in the US? Do you have any other relatives in this country? Start with simple questions. Then continue on to more complicated questions that require a better explanation. Do you know if your relatives are undocumented? What city and state do they live in? Do you have their contact information? Where are your parents? What are their names? If the child discloses that their one or two parents are deceased, you can ask, do you know their names? When did they pass away? Or when did you last see them? If the child hasn't seen their parents in quite some time, always ask him, when was the last time you saw their parents? Where are your parents now? And are your parents living together or separated? You can also ask, where's your mother? Where's your father? Do you know where they are, or have you heard from other people where your parents are? Do you know how to contact your mother or your father? Who did you last live with in your country? What is their contact information, and where are they currently at right now? Also, who is the person you trust the most to tell everything to? What's the relationship to you? Is this a relative, a friend? How do we contact them? Where are they located at? And if this is your first time in coming to the US. If it's not their first time here in the country, then ask when did they first come and why did they return to their country and how? Was it through a deport, voluntary departure? If they went through this process previously, then they're going to be familiar with those terms. Also, important things to ask are, did you travel with a family member? If yes, get as much information from that as possible. Get the family members' complete names, their relationships, and where they are now. Were they detained by Border Patrol with you? Were you separated along in the journey by the smuggler? Did they lose you in some way or another? Get as much as you can. In this section, the objective is to have a better understanding of the push and pull factors of coming to the US and leaving their home country. You can start simply. Why did you come to the US? Was it work, to study, to reunite with one or both parents, with your family members, or another reason? Also, it's important to ask if they wanted to come here or if they were sent here by their parents or by a relative here in the US. Then, we want to begin asking questions relevant to Special Immigrant Juvenile Status, SIJS. In this section, the objective is to have a chronology of the child's life and understand the reality of their life in relation to their caretakers. Understand if those in the household mistreated the child, if the child was ever abandoned, forced to leave their education or work. In addition, we need to understand who they can live with in their home country and if those caretakers can properly care for the child. After collecting this information, then you can make a better assessment of what the child's best interest is. Questions relevant to SIJ include: who did you live with? When were you born? Who else lived there in your household? After living with that person, did you live with someone else? It's pretty common that many of these children will have lived in several households along the way. Sometimes they may have lived with an aunt and then moved in with a cousin, then moved in with a stepfather before coming to the US. Always get the chronological information about who they lived with first, describe that setting in the household, and then continue on to the next household. Also important is, how did those caretakers treat you? Ask for every individual in the household. What was your relationship to not only the aunt and uncle that you were living with, but to the cousins that you may have shared a room with? Were you happy living there? Did those people treat you well? Were they a good person, a bad person to you? And why did you stop living there and move with another relative, or move in with a friend, or on your own? Can you give me an example of the worst mistreatment that you experienced in a household? How frequently were you mistreated? Did you ask for help? Did someone defend you? Why or why not? Around when were you last mistreated? And when was the last time you saw the person who mistreated you? Also important is to find out who supports the child economically. Was it the people in the household? Were maybe a relative or a parent sending money to provide for the child back in their home country? And just as important, how much communication did they have with their mother or father or both parents? Sometimes many of these children grow up for several years only calling their parents in the US, or through Skype, through email, or sometimes they may have lost communication with their parents for several years. Just as important, when you're dealing with children who have not had a traditional relationship with their parents, if their parents are here in the US and the child has been in their home country, ask about that. What were your parents like? How often did they communicate with you? Did they send you money? How often? Did they send you birthday presents? Did they call you or make any sort of effort to contact you frequently? When you did see them, when we did live with them, how did they treat you? Did they ever hit you? Does your mother or father drink? Are they a good or a bad person? What do they spend their money on when you were living with them? And up until what grade did you go to school? If the child may have stopped attending school after 6th grade or after a few years, always ask, why did you stop going? Was it to help the family, to work? Did your parents or your caretakers not have any more money to enroll you in school? All that information is very relevant and very important. If the child is talking about why they stopped going to school, another important question to ask is, maybe, did community violence have something to do with this? Were they being threatened by gang members, by cartel members in the area? It's not too common to hear stories of gang members hanging around schools to recruit children forcibly. Sometimes kids may have stopped going for this reason. And these are important questions to ask because they may lead to other more important questions and details that is pertinent to another form of relief. Other questions to ask is if the child ever worked in their home country. At what age did you start working? What did you do for work? Was it working in the fields? Was it working as a mechanic? Did you work doing other random jobs? What did you want to work in? And did you work because you wanted to or because you were forced to? And if you were forced to, who received the money that you made? Did you keep it for yourself, or did you have to give it to a family member or some other person? Next, we want to ask questions related to asylum. The objective of this portion is to understand if the child is afraid to return to their home country and if there is any sort of threat or danger upon returning. If there is, why or why not? If there is no threat or danger, who can the child live with if they return? Questions to ask include, if you had to return to your country, would you be afraid to return? If they say yes, then begin with why. Did you have any problems? With who? How did this begin? Did you suffer? Has that problem with this individual or with this group been resolved? If they say no, dig deeper. When did the problem begin? How did it start? How many times did you feel afraid? Were you threatened or were you harmed? How frequent? Did anyone else in your family or your household suffer because of this? Have the child explain it as a movie, for example. Keep asking, and then what happened? And then what happened? Until they finally say, this is it, nothing else happened, and then I came to the US. Also important is information related to their relationship to the authorities in their country. If the child did have some kind of problem back in home country, did they ever make a police report? Did they reach out to some local authority? Why or why not? When was this problem resolved, if it even was? And if they were to return to their home country, who could they live with? With their previous caretakers? With someone else? And what would the child do if they go back to their home country? Would they go back to school? Would they work? Would they stay briefly before attempting to come to the US again? Try to get as much information as possible. Our next set of questions are relevant to trafficking issues. The objective here is to identify potential victims of child trafficking, forced labor, abuse, and exploitation during the journey to the US. Questions you may want to consider asking include, who paid for your trip to the United States? And if you don't know this person, how did you meet them? How did you become aware of them? And why did they agree to help you? Did you know them before, or did another family member know them before? If the child or their family took out a loan to pay for the journey, does the child have a responsibility to pay for this debt? If they say they do, ask them, how do they plan to pay off this debt? And what happens when they don't pay the money? Is there any sort of consequence to them or their family? If the child reunifies with the person who gave them the money, what does that person plan to do with you? Do they want you to work for them? Are they going to be okay with just taking care of you? Try to find that out. Just as important, we need to ask them if they have any sort of job waiting for them in the US. If yes, do they know what they will be working in? What will they be doing? Who will they be working for, and how much will they be expected to be paid? And will they be able to leave that job if they want to, or if they don't like it? Our next set of questions involve the journey to the US. And the objective here is to identify abuse or exploitation during the trip to the US. Begin with simple questions like, how long did the trip last? Which countries did you have to travel through? What was the worst thing that happened to you in this journey? Was something bad? Can you talk to me about it? Did you work during the trip? And if you did, in what? With who? How much did you get paid? Were you mistreated? And ask if they had to deal with any authorities in other countries. Did the Guatemalan or the Mexican immigration authorities detain you? Did they deport you from their countries? And if so, what did they do to you? How did they treat you? And how were you able to come back again? Then we want to ask questions related to the U visa. The objective here is to identify if the child was a victim of a crime in the US or a crime that violates the laws of the United States. If they have been, we need to identify if the child has collaborated or is willing to collaborate with authorities to do an investigation. You can start with simple questions, such as, after crossing the river or the border, how long were you in the US before immigration detained you? Where did you sleep after crossing the border before you were detained? What were you doing? Did something bad happen to you after you crossed the border? If so, were you able to report the violence or this abuse to an authority, to a Border Patrol agent? And if you didn't, if you haven't, then would you like to report this violence? And if you were a victim of violence, do you know what happened? Do you know their names, or can you describe them? Any physical characteristics that you remember from the abusers? Do you remember the place where you were being held at? All these questions are relevant to a possible investigation that can lead to a U visa grant for the child. Our next section deals with suppression. In this section, we need to identify any mistreatment, coercion, or duress by immigration authorities during apprehension and detention. You can begin by asking the child, how did immigration treat you when they detained you? When you were in the processing station, how were you treated by different agents? How long were you in this processing station? How did they treat you? If they mistreated you, do you remember who did it? Do you remember the names on their uniforms? What did they say to you? What happened? And did anyone else see, or did you see anyone else be mistreated? If they were mistreated, or if they feel like they were mistreated, always offer them the option of writing a Border Patrol complaint letter. These letters may serve as a way for our immigration authorities to not only develop better policies when it comes to detaining children, but also better policies in how to treat children who are in processing centers while they were initially detained. We're then going to move on to the Notice to Appear, the NTA. You don't really need to ask the child too many questions when it comes to the NTA, but it is important to write down very important information that is in that document. Always take note of the Notice to Appear date, the date of entry, the port of entry, and the charges written on the NTA. Review the NTA with the child, go over the major concepts, and ensure that the child understands the significance of the NTA and what it means for them. When you're wrapping up the interview, thank the child for their time and sharing a bit of their life with you. Explain that if someone has any more questions or concerns about what you wrote down, there can be a follow-up. Give the child time to ask you questions. Always remind the child that you are available to meet up with him or her if they want to disclose something they did not initially disclose.